Europe. The year was 1348. Before sunrise, the bells were already ringing. Not for a wedding, not for a celebration, for the dead. In a small village, a mother woke her son, but he didn't answer. She placed her hand on his forehead. Cold. The night before, he had been laughing. By morning, he was gone. Outside, another house had its door shut. Then another.
The village was beginning to understand something terrifying. This was not a normal sickness. People were dying too quickly, and the dead were beginning to outnumber the living. But this was not happening in one village. Hundreds of kilometers away, the same thing was happening in crowded cities. Florence, Paris, Marseille, and across the English Channel. London. Everywhere, the story was beginning the same way. A fever, a swelling, a few days of suffering, then silence. And then we have to go back. Back to the moment when the nightmare entered Europe.
In the autumn of 1347, ships arrived at Messina. They had come from the Black Sea, but something was terribly wrong. There were no sailors calling from the deck, no busy movement, no welcoming cries, only silence. When people finally boarded the ship, they found the crew. Many were already dead, others were barely alive. And among them, something had arrived in Europe. Something invisible. Something that would kill millions. The Black Death. To understand the Black Death, we have to see Europe before it arrived. Because the world that existed before the plague would not survive it. The Black Death did not appear in Europe from nowhere. Long before the first European cities fell silent, an enormous network already connected east and west. Traders crossed deserts, ships crossed seas, caravans moved between distant cities. Silk, spices, grain, precious metals, and thousands of people were constantly on the move. For centuries, these routes had connected civilizations. But the same roads that carried wealth could also carry disease. And hidden among the cargo, there could be passengers no merchant had noticed. Small, almost invisible, and potentially deadly. The plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, could circulate among animal populations. Fleas could become infected and transmit the bacteria between hosts. Medieval people knew nothing about this invisible chain. Eventually, the disease reached the world around the Black Sea. Here, the great trading networks of Europe and Asia came together. And from these ports, the path toward the Mediterranean was open. Ships came and went constantly. Grain, cloth, animals, people. Every journey connected one port to another. But somewhere within this busy world, something had changed. People began becoming sick, and then they began dying. The ships continued moving, across the Black Sea, through the Mediterranean, toward the ports of Europe. And nobody aboard understood what they were carrying. The Mediterranean was the gateway to Europe, and one of its busiest ports was Messina. In 1347, a fleet approached the harbor. From a distance, it looked ordinary. Wooden ships, sails, cargo, sailors. But as the ships came closer, something felt wrong. There were no cheerful calls from the sailors, no merchants shouting, no celebration. Only the sound of the water against the wooden hull. The people of Messina did not know it yet, but the danger had already arrived. Within months, the plague would move beyond the harbor, into the streets, into the homes, and eventually across an entire continent. And then, the dying began. In the autumn of 1347, the ships entered the harbor of Messina. At first, nobody knew what they had brought with them, but within days, people began to fall sick. The sickness began suddenly. Fever, weakness, pain. Then came something even more frightening, a painful swelling beneath the skin. Medieval doctors had seen disease before. They had theories, they had treatments, but they had no answer. And then, the sickness began appearing outside the homes. The marketplace began to empty. Soon the bells began ringing again, and this time, they seemed to ring without stopping. Messina had become one of the first places in Europe to confront the new plague. But the disease was not going to remain there. It was already moving. But Messina was only the beginning. From Messina, the ships carried the disease beyond Sicily. Trade routes connected the Mediterranean world. Ships reached the great ports of Italy. And from port to port, Venice. Then inland, Florence. The routes continued north. The disease was following the same routes as commerce. What began in one harbor was becoming a continental disaster. Port after port, city after city, the plague followed. And Europe had no idea what was coming. Then people began to disappear, not because they had fled, but because they had died. Soon, there were too many. Church bells began to ring, again and again. Soon, there were too many dead to bury in the old way. Graves were dug faster and deeper. Even the churchyards began to fill. Carts began moving through the streets, carrying away those who had died. Families locked their doors. They stopped welcoming strangers. They stopped leaving their homes. Markets that once overflowed with people began to fall silent. Some houses were simply left behind. Those who still dared to trade kept their distance. Fear spread faster than the disease. Every knock became a question. Who was outside? And could they be carrying the plague? Priests tried to comfort the dying, but even they could not keep up. Every day brought more sick, more families asking for help, more people with nowhere to go. And slowly, even the helpers began to disappear. Streets that once echoed with voices now carried only the wind. And when night came, the darkness felt different. Only the bells continued ringing through the night. People began to realize this was no ordinary sickness. From the ports to the cities, from villages to the countryside, the plague was everywhere. And there was nowhere left to run. It was no longer one person in a house. Whole families were falling sick together. Outside, the world continued. Inside, entire households waited in silence. There were no doctors who could save everyone, and no medicine that could stop what was happening. Parents watched their children. Children watched their parents. And no one knew who would be next. Even monasteries could not escape. Monks opened their doors to the suffering. They cared for those who had nowhere else to turn. But even faith had limits. There were simply too many people asking for help. The places meant to help them could no longer contain them. There were no more beds. Outside, even the dead had to wait. Graves were no longer being prepared one at a time. Gravediggers worked from morning until dark, and the carts kept coming. The streets were still there, but the people were disappearing from them. Some villages simply emptied. Fields went untended. Harvests were left to rot. Even animals were left behind. The roads that once connected Europe fell strangely quiet. Across Europe, the living were learning how to live with the dead. As the death toll grew, something else began to disappear. The workers. Blacksmiths stopped working. Carpenters stopped building. Merchants stopped selling. And in the countryside, the fields began to go untended. With fewer hands working the land, food became harder to find. What remained became more expensive. For the poor, survival became even harder. Even the wealthy could no longer ignore the crisis. Manors that once hummed with activity began to fall quiet. The old order depended on millions of people doing their part. Now, millions were gone. The plague was no longer only a disease. It was changing society itself. And Europe was about to change forever. But the worst was still to come. No one knew exactly how many had died. There was no system to count them. The lists grew longer and longer. In villages, people counted the missing by memory. Many were buried without names. Some families disappeared so completely that their homes were left exactly as they had been. In the cities, whole streets began to vanish from daily life. The bells rang so often that their sound became part of everyday life. Eventually, the numbers became almost impossible to comprehend. Across Europe, the loss was measured not in hundreds, but in millions. Entire communities had been erased, and Europe would never be the same again. And still, the bells rang. But the Black Death did more than kill. It changed the people who survived it. But some survived, and for them the world had changed forever. Slowly people returned to the fields. Empty homes found new occupants. But something unexpected happened. There were now far fewer workers. And surviving workers could demand more. For centuries, the wealthy had held most of the power. Now that balance was beginning to change. The old order was beginning to crack, and the cities slowly began to breathe again. Children were born into a Europe they had never known before. They had lost almost everything, but they were still here. The Black Death had taken millions, but it had also transformed the world they left behind. The plague ended, but its consequences would last for centuries. But the story of the Black Death was not just a story of death. It was a story of survival and transformation. Europe had survived the plague, but it was no longer the Europe that had existed before it. With fewer workers, their labor became more valuable. Wages rose, and some ordinary people gained opportunities their parents had never imagined. People began leaving places where land was abundant and moving toward places where work was available. Cities began attracting survivors from the countryside. The old feudal system had been shaken. Old obligations were questioned. New agreements were negotiated. Vast areas of farmland had been abandoned, and nature began reclaiming what people had left behind. The survivors also began to see life differently. Churches filled with memorials. Families remembered those who were gone. The dead became part of the memory of an entire generation. The Black Death had not simply ended an era. It had opened the door to another. Europe moved forward, but it carried the memory of the plague with it. The Black Death killed millions, but the world that survived it was a different world.
The Black Death changed Europe forever. But history is full of stories like this. Stories that changed the world, yet are slowly being forgotten. If you want to uncover more of these forgotten stories, subscribe to High Sky Studios and turn on the notifications, because the next story is waiting to be discovered. See you in the next documentary.